Margaret Truman was born into one of the most famous families in the world. The daughter of Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States. From the moment she entered the world, Margaret's life was one marked by contrasts. On one hand, she was the only child of a man who would go on to shape the course of American history. On the other hand, she was a woman desperately trying to carve out her own identity in the shadow of her father's monumental legacy. Despite all her accomplishments, from her early career as a singer to her success as an author, Margaret's life was often overshadowed by the constant public attention and by the immense pressure to live up to expectations that were beyond her control. This is her story, a tale of struggle, resilience, and the quest to be seen as more than just the president's daughter. Margaret Truman's early years were marked by simplicity. She was born on February 17, 1924, in Independence, Missouri, into a middle-class family. Harry S. Truman, her father, was a county judge, and her mother, Bess Wallace Truman, was a private and reserved woman who valued simplicity and privacy. Their home, a modest Victorian house on Delaware Street, was far removed from the corridors of power that Margaret would later come to know. The Truman family wasn't wealthy or politically connected at the time, and Margaret's childhood was a serene one, filled with the love and attention of her parents. Harry Truman, a man known for his deep affection for his daughter, often played the piano for her and would sing alongside her. These moments of intimacy between father and daughter were deeply meaningful and created an emotional foundation that would last throughout Margaret's life. Margaret was her father's pride and joy, and this bond shaped her in ways that would have a profound effect on her later years. Margaret was an only child, and her relationship with her parents, particularly her father, was the cornerstone of her emotional development. Despite the love and warmth in her family, Margaret's life was about to change drastically. In 1934, when Margaret was just 10 years old, Harry Truman was elected to the United States Senate. The family's life shifted immediately as they began to divide their time between Washington, D.C., where Margaret attended a private school for girls, and their home in Independence. The political sphere was a world in which Margaret was introduced gradually, but it would ultimately define her life. In 1945, when President Franklin D. Roosevelt passed away and her father ascended to the presidency, Margaret's world was completely upended. At the age of 21, Margaret suddenly found herself in the White House, in the midst of the greatest political stage on earth. The shift from a quiet, middle-class upbringing to life as the daughter of the President of the United States was immediate and total. Margaret was thrust into a world where her every move would be scrutinized, and the pressure to live up to her father's newfound status was immense. When Harry Truman became president, Margaret's life took a turn that no one could have predicted. As the first daughter, Margaret was now subject to constant public attention. At just 21 years old, she was thrust into the spotlight, and her every move was watched by the press and the public. The White House, which had once been a private residence, became a stage where Margaret's actions and words were subject to intense scrutiny. Margaret quickly learned how to navigate the social world of Washington, D.C. Her upbringing, which had taught her how to behave with grace and composure, helped her in her new role as the president's daughter. But despite her training and social ease, Margaret was always keenly aware that she was more than just the daughter of a powerful man. She was Margaret Truman, and she wanted to be seen for who she was, not just for her familial connections. Her singing career, which had begun before her father became president, became one of the most public aspects of her life. Margaret was trained as a coloratura soprano, a demanding vocal style requiring years of disciplined practice. She performed in numerous prestigious venues across the country, and even made her professional debut in 1947 with the Detroit Symphony Orchestra. Yet, her performances were always met with mixed reviews. Some audiences loved her, Some critics found her voice lacking in technical precision. But what was most apparent was that, for many, her success was tied more to her father's political stature than her own abilities. The turning point came in 1950, when a music critic named Paul Hume published a particularly harsh review of Margaret's performance. In the review, Hume pointed out that Margaret's singing lacked the professional polish expected of a soprano. The review caused an uproar, and her father, Harry Truman, responded by writing a fiery letter to Hume, threatening him with physical violence. This infamous letter was published and caused a national scandal, which further intensified the public's interest in Margaret. Though the public largely sided with Harry Truman in the controversy, the incident marked the beginning of a long struggle for Margaret. She found herself torn between her desire to pursue her singing career and the weight of her father's presidency. Over time, the pressure from critics and the constant media attention made it harder for her to continue performing. Eventually, Margaret stepped away from singing to focus on her family and other pursuits. But the question of whether her success had been due to her father's fame would always linger. As Margaret entered her 30s, her life took on a new, quieter rhythm with her marriage to Clifton Daniel in 1956. Clifton, a respected journalist at the New York Times, provided her with the stability she had longed for, and together, they had 4 children. This new chapter in Margaret's life allowed her to retreat from the public spotlight and focus on her family. Becoming a wife and mother gave her a sense of peace that she had never fully experienced during her years under the public's gaze as the president's daughter. However, even in her personal life, the shadow of her father's legacy loomed large. Margaret had always loved her family, and she poured herself into her children, taking great pride in her role as a mother. But there was a part of her that longed for something more. Something outside the confines of her famous family. She was still Margaret Truman, the daughter of the president, and no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't completely escape this identity. This tension between her role as a private person and her public persona would never fully leave her. Despite the joy of raising her children and building a life with Clifton, Margaret often found herself grappling with the weight of her father's legacy. The expectations placed upon her by society, by her family, and by her own sense of self, were ever present, and she found it increasingly difficult to reconcile her private desires with the public image that had been thrust upon her. It was during this period that Margaret turned to writing. In 1956, she published Souvenir, a memoir that explored her life as the daughter of President Harry S. Truman. The book was a way for Margaret to take control of her own narrative and express herself outside the shadow of her father's towering legacy. Souvenir was a poignant reflection of her life, a blend of personal anecdotes and family history, written with the kind of emotional clarity that only someone who had lived in such extraordinary circumstances could provide. Although Souvenir was well received, Margaret knew that writing about her family was only one part of her journey. She couldn't remain forever in the realm of her father's memory. She needed to find her own voice, one that wasn't defined by her public persona or her famous family. And so, she began working on new projects, including books about her parents, which allowed her to delve deeper into her own experiences, while also contributing to historical narratives. By the 1960s, Margaret Truman had firmly established herself as an author. After her father's death in 1972, she wrote a biography of him, Harry S. Truman, published in 1973. The book was a critical success, praised for its intimacy and historical insight. Margaret's close relationship with her father allowed her to write a biography that not only chronicled his political achievements, but also delved deeply into his personal life, something that only his daughter could have written with such authenticity. The success of the biography marked a turning point for Margaret. She had established herself as a respected author, and this success allowed her to explore new creative avenues. It wasn't long before Margaret surprised many by venturing into a completely new genre, mystery fiction. In 1980, she published Murder in the White House, the first book in her capital crimes series, a collection of mystery novels set in Washington, D.C. These novels, featuring intrigue and suspense within the political world she knew so well, became immensely popular, attracting a new audience that had no connection to her father's presidency. The Capital Crimes series was a revelation for Margaret. It marked a significant departure from her previous works, and it allowed her to explore her creative talents in a way that felt entirely her own. The novels were well received, and made her a commercially successful novelist in her own right. Over the next 2 decades, Margaret would go on to write 25 novels in the series, each capturing the essence of Washington, D.C. and the political intrigue she had grown up with, all while shedding the weight of her father's legacy. For the first time in her life, Margaret could truly claim a career that was hers and hers alone. The question of whether she was truly successful, or just the president's daughter, faded into the background. Margaret Truman had found her voice, not in music, not in her father's shadow, but in the world of fiction, where she could build her own legacy. In the early 2000s, Margaret faced immense personal tragedy. In 2000, her beloved husband Clifton Daniel passed away. Just 6 months later, her son William was tragically killed in a car accident. The loss of Clifton, who had been a constant presence in her life for over 4 decades, left Margaret devastated. William's death, just months after Clifton's, compounded her grief, leaving her emotionally shattered. Despite the deep sorrow that consumed her, Margaret continued to write. She kept herself busy with her literary work, her involvement with the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library, and maintaining a semblance of normalcy. But the pain of losing both her husband and son was something that no amount of work could fill. The life that she had built, filled with love, family, and the warmth of her home, had been irreversibly changed. For Margaret, the grief was not just emotional, it was physical too. She had always been a strong woman. A woman who had weathered the pressures of being the first daughter, and had built a career despite constant public scrutiny. But losing the people she loved most was a blow that she struggled to recover from. Yet, in typical Truman fashion, Margaret faced these challenges with resilience. She continued to write and stay active, though those closest to her could see the toll that the losses had taken on her. As she dealt with the grief of losing her husband and son, Margaret moved to Chicago in the early 2000s to be closer to her surviving son, Clifton. It was a quiet, more solitary life, and she began to make plans for the final years of her life. Margaret knew that her time was limited, and she made peace with the fact that the vibrant life she had once known in New York was over. In the final months of her life, she moved to a care facility in Chicago, where she spent her last days. In her final years, Margaret Truman was still active in her writing and her work with the Truman Presidential Library. Her last book, Murder on K Street, was published in 2007, just a year before her death. Despite her declining health, Margaret continued to contribute to the legacy of her father and her own body of work. Her strength and resilience were evident in the way she continued to engage with the world, even as her health deteriorated. Margaret passed away on January 29, 2008, at the age of 83. She had lived a life full of contradictions, publicly adored and privately torn. A daughter living in the shadow of her father, while carving out her own legacy. Her death marked the end of an era for the Truman family. But Margaret's contributions to literature and her own unique legacy will never be forgotten. Margaret Truman left behind a body of work that includes 25 mystery novels, biographies of her parents, and numerous works about the White House and its history. Her literary career, which spanned decades, was defined not by her father's name, but by her own dedication to her craft. She was a woman who, despite the weight of history, found a way to tell her own story, through her writing, her music, and her resilience. Margaret Truman's life story is a testament to the complexity of living in the shadow of greatness, while striving to define oneself. Though she was born into extraordinary circumstances, Margaret never stopped fighting to make a name for herself. Whether as a singer, an author, or a mother, Margaret's journey was marked by both personal triumphs and heartbreaks. Her legacy is a reminder that even those who live under the glare of the public eye must struggle to carve out their own path. And in doing so, they can create something truly their own. Margaret Truman was more than just the daughter of a president. She was a talented artist, a resilient woman, and a successful novelist. Her story is one of strength, independence, and the relentless pursuit of authenticity. Through her books, her music, and her life, Margaret Truman showed the world that even in the face of immense pressure, it is possible to remain true to oneself and leave a lasting legacy.